You're probably listening to this podcast because you're interested in property or money and success. And while today we'll be talking about Australia's economy, what we discuss really relates to all of these things. You see, despite all those interest rate rises the Reserve Bank's been throwing at us, trying to slow inflation, trying to slow our spending, Australia's GDP expanded at the fastest annual rate this century in the September quarter as the economy accelerated from the COVID-related lockdowns a year ago. So today I'd like to share with you 13 things you need to know about our economy as I chat with Ken Race, Director of Metropole Wealth Advisory. But don't worry, this isn't going to be one of those really heavy discussions. However, we do want to give you the type of information you need to understand so you can know what's ahead for 2023, as this will affect our property markets, your businesses, your job, and I guess your hip pockets, including your wages. So welcome to today's show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Despite this year's steep rise in interest rates, Aussies keep spending, and this consumer cash splash continued driving robust economic growth. Australia's economy, measured by the GDP, rose 0.6% in the seasonally adjusted September quarter. In fact, it was up 5.9% throughout the year, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And once again, it was actually household spending that drove our economy GDP growth. So today I'd like to share with you 13 things you need to know about Australia's economy. And to help me unpack this, I'm going to chat with Ken Race, founder and director of Metropole Wealth Advisory, who's actually a lifelong student of the economy and economics. Hi, Ken.
How are you, Michael?
Well, it's coming to the end of the year, and it actually looks like maybe even the end of the strength of this economic cycle. It seems the post-pandemic economic boom starting to plateau. Maybe Australians are starting to brace for the full weight of the interest rate rises that didn't really show in the September quarter figures. It takes a while, a lag, for all this to happen. Maybe Australians are now going to start bracing for the new year, for the Reserve Bank's raising in interest rates, but that's what it wants. But having said that, this time round, household spending continued to drive economic growth. We spent a lot on ourselves this time round, Ken.
We certainly did. And maybe that's part of, we work hard, so maybe we should reward ourselves a little bit.
Oh, I think that was the feeling after COVID, wasn't it?
It was. I think this sense of relief, and it's the little things that count. So while people didn't spend big, they spent little amounts in a lot of places.
Well, on hotels, on cafes, on restaurants, that was up 5.5%. Transport was up 14%. And actually, we were still buying vehicles, maybe not as much properties as you say with the big items, but it was really discretionary spending that continued to grow despite the cost of living pressures. But again, the latest figures that just came out for the September quarter, July, August, September, and interest rates only started rising in May, and we know there's quite a lag to that. So the Reserve Bank wants to slow things down. But let's look at 13 things that I guess we all should understand about the economy to help us be better property investors, better business people, better entrepreneurs. And if we start with, as I said, the economy grew this time around, but it was the fourth quarter of consecutive growth since COVID slowed us down. We actually had a little bit of a recession 2 years ago. Most people even forget that happened, that those 2 quarters of negative growth, Ken.
That's right. And maybe just to take our listeners back to basics, what is gross domestic product? That is the measure of the things we make.
Mm-hmm.
The more we make, the more we're employed, the more we buy raw materials. So that's a very good measure of the health, if you like, of the economy. And the growth factor is how much did it go up or down from the previous number? and it's measured
That's a
quarterly.
good point because it's not how high it is or how expensive it is. It's the change, isn't it, Ken?
Correct. And so we're looking for that upward change, particularly if it's been down for a while. And as you said, if it goes down twice in a row, so that's over 6 months, they call it a recession. And that's bad because that sort of creates a lot of unease in other parts of the economy. So we had a sort of false start with one little negative GDP growth, and we're now seeing an uplift. And as such, people are now starting to feel a bit more confident.
Well, in fact, Australia's $2.2 trillion economy is 6.4% larger than before the pandemic struck. So, yes, we're doing okay. Now, another important factor to understand, though, is that we're spending more and we're saving less. Look, over COVID, households did save. I guess we didn't have the opportunity to spend, especially for us in Melbourne who were locked down for so long. So the household savings ratio grew very strongly. And it seems like we're now starting to spend that stash of cash we had, Ken.
That's it. I mean, that household savings ratio certainly got up around the 12%, and now it's sort of gradually been reducing. And we saw that through COVID. People didn't have as much overtime, they didn't have jobs, so they had to dip into that savings pond. We're now seeing that people are now a little bit more relaxed, unemployment levels are quite robust, and as such, they're putting their hand in their pocket and spending a bit more, as you said, on consumable items, on discretionary expenditure. And discretionary expenditure is the things we buy if we don't have to buy it.
Okay, and that's what I guess the Reserve Bank's going to hope we stop doing by scaring us a bit, by talking about rising interest rates and actually by hitting our hip pocket nerves, isn't it?
That's right. So, at the end of the day, you do have to buy food, but how much food? Mind you, when lettuce is $10, you do
Yeah.
without as opposed to spending it. But yes, so they're trying to dampen our requirements to spend. And when they raise interest rates, they're sort of taking money away from us so we don't spend it in other areas.
Okay, another fact to know what's happened over the last little while is that consumer prices rose 1.8% during the September quarter, and we know inflation is going to keep rising for a little while longer. It rose 7.3% compared to the last year. And again, it's actually the change in the cost of that basket of goods that they look at for the CPI rather than the fact that costs are high when we talk about the change in the CPI. That was actually the fastest growth in the CPI since 1990. And I guess we're still going to have a little bit of a raise in CPI, but we're getting close to the peak. But this time around, the major drivers, Ken, were housing, gas, and furniture. It's interesting how energy expenses are a very large factor in CPI at the moment. What's going on that energy is costing so much more?
I think it's a factor of a number of things. We've obviously seen the conflicts in the Ukraine with Russia. We're seeing, if you like, the more traditional forms of energy creation, coal, being shut down. So that puts more pressure on the generation. And I think we're seeing that what would I call it? The subsidies into the alternatives are pushing up those prices. And fourthly, maybe the spending on new transmission lines to actually move these alternative energies. So that's a big, big factor. But the one that people can see the easiest, I think, is the coal prices and the gas prices. And
Yes, yeah. And electricity.
and yeah, that generates electricity. So they're the inputs into electricity generation.
Now, interestingly, for a country that produces LNG and coal and other of the raw materials to create electricity, it surprises me how expensive it is for us. But from what I understand, Ken, we actually have to pay the same prices, the prices when we export them. There's no real advantage to Australians for being able to produce these items.
Correct. And one of the reasons for that, I think, was quite solid. It was if we didn't pay locally that price, two things would happen. The producers wouldn't sell into the local market. And thirdly,
That
they
makes
would
sense.
spend money on exploration. So that's one of the other impacts on increasing electricity prices and energy prices, is that we're actually not exploring and finding more to have an oversupply to then want to put back into the market.
Well, that's going to be really interesting because we know our population is going to grow. We know it's going to grow to probably 29 million from 26 million by 2030 and probably to 40 million people by the middle of this century. It'll be interesting to see how our creaking infrastructure is going to cope.
That's right. So we've got infrastructure needs, obviously water, electricity, roads, and then just the things that we need to live. But, I was driving through Sydney. I live in Sydney, as a lot of listeners know, early in the morning when you actually, in the Uber, you look out the window and the number of cranes in Sydney. I mean, they're rebuilding Sydney with a number of roads, bridges, etc., etc. And I see the same here in Melbourne, also in other parts of Australia, Brisbane, Adelaide. So there is this infrastructure boom, which is employing people, which is one of the reasons I think our unemployment levels are at the levels that they are.
Well, as we go through 13 things we all need to understand about the Australian economy, another one is that wages growth, even though it's gone up, has actually trailed inflation. It hasn't gone up as much. So the unemployment rate was very, very low. It's dropped to less than 3.5%. And in some states, I know in New South Wales, it's even less than that. And we know that inflation's gone up around 7%. But overall, wages have only gone up around 3.2%. In one way, that's a pain for people who are getting wages because their real spending power has decreased. But on the other hand, it's stopping us getting the wage price spiral that you and I remember from many, many years ago when inflation was a big factor, and that's actually occurring overseas at the moment, Ken.
Correct. And I think one of the points to make if you dissect that number is historically over the previous decade, if you want, certainly 5 years, most of the wages growth has come from the public sector. And we're now seeing it coming through the private sector. And private sector wage rose by 3.4%. And that's certainly the highest in nearly a decade. So we're just seeing the beginning of that at the moment.
So as we keep going through what's changed, one of the factors was that, in fact, we're getting back out in the world. I've been lucky enough to recently go overseas, but in the September quarter, it showed that relaxed international travel restrictions meant that spending on overseas travel grew by 58%. Now, of course, it grew by a huge number like that because there was hardly any international travel a little while ago. And that's where the figures in some ways are a little bit deceptive when you see the change quarter on quarter or year on year when you talk about CPI.
That's right. So we are certainly re-engaging with the world, not as much with China as we had hoped, but that's for two reasons. The Chinese economy is certainly being dampened for a number of reasons. And, they had these, zero COVID policy. So that meant activity in China relaxed. We've had, our goods were made a little bit harder to get into China. But there's other parts of Southeast Asia where our goods are going. We're certainly seeing some free trade agreements opening up in different parts of Europe and the US. So I think in a way that's a good thing. We're sort of moving our dependence away from one very large customer, China, and diversifying. So hopefully we don't get these shocks that we've had in the recent past.
Well, that's a good point. So just getting back to the international travel, even though we are travelling more, it's only reached international travel numbers have reached 56% of the pre-pandemic levels. But we're getting back to holidays. It'll be interesting to see what happens in this next quarter with the Christmas holidays. But one of the interesting factors when we're looking at the various industries that contributed to economic growth, the air transport industry rose 25.2%. Construction is back, and you mentioned that. And it's not just housing construction with the home builder grants pushing domestic construction, but also engineering and infrastructure. But interestingly, coal mining activity has fallen for 4 quarters in a row. And I guess that's not too surprising with all the talk about climate change, Ken.
That's right. And certainly there's been a number of coal mine projects now put on the back burner. So, they haven't commenced, and some of the expansion of some of the existing mines hasn't occurred. So, airline travel is, particularly domestic, is certainly quite busy. And, having caught a few flights over recent months, most of the planes are taking off full. People are travelling a bit more locally, which is a good thing. So, that's helping the Australian economy, given that a lot of people are worried or didn't want to go overseas, unlike you when you went.
Well, nobody was wearing masks on the plane. People weren't wearing masks overseas. That was nice. One of the other factors to consider when we're looking at things we should understand about what's happening in the Australian economy is domestic mobility increased, purchase of transport services increased, and we actually bought more cars, but that's partly because the supply of cars have now increased. Remember, there was a bottleneck a while ago. You couldn't buy a car, and the price of used cars went up over our COVID bottlenecks. And also catering and accommodation services grew. So we're doing a bit more domestic travelling.
That's right. And I think with the bottleneck of new vehicles coming into Australia, as you said, second-hand cars, skyrocketed in price. And I think that put a lot of people off. Why pay more or the same for a car that's 3 years old compared to a new car? So they delayed their decisions to buy. And now that we're seeing that new cars coming back into Australia, then people are now buying and filling that previously pent-up demand where they had stopped. Some of the cars are going into business activity. A lot of businesses are restocking, and one of the things that they're restocking, apart from this machinery and tools, is they're trading in the cars and buying more efficient cars. And we've certainly seen that big increase in electronic vehicles compared to the internal combustion.
Yes, tending to see a lot more of those hybrid vehicles, aren't we? I was actually in a friend's one yesterday, and we got in and he turned it on. There was no noise. I was waiting to hear the engine turn over.
And we're now seeing the government adding a lot of subsidies for the purchase of electronic vehicles.
It'll be interesting how the motor industry changes. I guess I wouldn't be buying petrol stations as an investment in the short term, Ken.
And just as an aside, no one's talked about replacing this 16, 17 billion of petrol excise duties. Like if you don't sell petrol, there's going to be a $17 billion gap in our budget. That's per year.
Yes, yeah, because a large part of what we pay at the petrol pump is taxes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that means our electricity costs are going to go up, aren't they? Now, as we talk about the economy, we spoke a lot about the domestic economy, but also exports are important, an important part of the economy. And while wet weather hampered exports of coal, rural exports surged, and that was actually led by wool and cotton.
Yes. As we have famously said here in Australia, riding on a sheep's back. And it's a natural fibre. I think people appreciate that. Cotton is as well, but cotton is a very heavy user of water. So there's some little negatives with high cotton growth as compared to wool, but both seeing a resurgence.
And when we look at what we spend on bringing imports in, they went up as well, but not as much as exports. So that's good for our terms of trade. But interestingly, the big factor that we imported was mobile phones. That was a big factor. That was actually before the release of the new iPhone, which only happened after the September quarter. But I guess maybe there was a bit of a pent-up demand there as well.
I think so. And, there's been a bit of a bottleneck on those new iPhones and, but we're seeing all the other makes being sold. And it's interesting you mentioned iPhone. So Apple is looking at diversifying its manufacturing capabilities so it doesn't get caught in the same supply chain issues that it's recently gone through.
Sure. Well, Most of the iPhones were made in, I think all of them were made in China, and that would be a concern for Apple, I would think.
Yeah. And, as you're saying, that led to a 5.7% increase in growth.
The import of communication goods. Now, back to exports, though, one of the interesting things we're exporting, and I can see this only growing with the use of electric cars, was lithium exports. They did really well this quarter.
They certainly did. We're seeing lithium exports, topping up at about $13-14 billion a year. That last quarter, I think it was just a touch under 3.4 billion. And there's a number of mines just going through their final stages of approval to open up, because most of that lithium or all of the lithium in most of the electronic vehicles we see comes from other countries. And there's some issues with where that lithium is coming from. So Australia, I think, is poised to take on that mantle of lithium, as well as other many rare earths. And a lot of the exploration is bearing fruit in Australia for rare earths. I think over the next decade, those sorts of products are certainly going to skyrocket in export potential.
Great. Well, one of the other interesting factors, if we look back at what happened over the quarter, was private business investment rose, led by an infrastructure building boom. Home building activity increased. And as we've already said, there was an increase in infrastructure spending. How's the government keep track of private business growth, Ken? Because I know at Metropole Wealth Advisory, you don't only help property investors, but a lot of your clients are entrepreneurs and business people.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways that the government can track that. So certainly via import statistics, that when people import machinery, but there are local statistical reports that businesses fill out, which talks about business investment. So as well as looking at sentiment, they actually pick up raw data. And then the government, through the ABS, then gets hold of that. So they can actually see the physical dollars spent just as much as the sentiment surveys pick up what business owners or consumers think is going to happen. This is a stake in the sand where they can actually see the dollar expenditure.
Now, before we get on to some more factors that we need to understand about the Australian economy, we got sidetracked a bit by me mentioning that you are a director of Metropole Wealth Advisory. Now, I know that a large percentage of the clients at Metropole Wealth Advisory come for ideas about structuring of their properties, property investments, estate planning. But I know one of the big factors that you've been concentrating on in the last little while is people's superannuation funds. And I know even personally, you've done an audit of mine. And that's not an audit of how the super fund's going, but an audit of have I got everything in place? Because if I don't, considering there's been a number of changes to superannuation legislation and what we have to do when you run your own self-managed super fund, the penalties if you don't get it right are pretty horrendous, aren't they?
Quite significant and quite horrendous. So as I tell our clients, that they're either doing things that are incorrect and then that creates the penalties, but equally so, they're not optimizing out of their self-managed super funds. And as you say, we're not talking about the actual asset allocation or what they buy in the super, but the way the deed is put together. And the deed is the rules that you employ while operating your self-managed super fund. They don't have the right rules, or they're not operating to the maximum that the rules allow. So once people realize that, then there's if you like, that's a step change in what they can do in their self-managed super fund. And, just to close it off, many clients, new clients, not existing clients, I don't let them make those mistakes. Many new clients really have a hole in their self-managed super fund with the question of what happens when I die.
Now, that is a big problem as you get older, because sometimes you'd actually have to sell off the asset or assets in the super fund when you don't particularly want to.
Correct. There's almost an inbuilt clause that a lot of people operate that forces a sale. And as you said, it could be at an inopportune time. They then have to maybe pay capital gains tax. They then lose the tax concessions. So those sorts of issues are avoidable with the correctly worded deed.
Now, some people are going to say, but I have my super fund audited because it has to be, but the auditor doesn't look at those sort of things. It makes sure that you're correct with your accounting. And yes, your accountant probably has set up your self-managed super fund, but being a trust deed, it is a document with words and clauses, and that can be amended. It's not a set and forget thing, is it, Ken?
Absolutely. We shouldn't set and forget it. Superannuation rules are changing all the time. And the way the law is structured in Australia, any legislative changes are automatically picked up by the industry funds and the retail funds, whether they change their deeds or not. But in the self managed super fund space, you physically have to make the change yourself.
So if you're interested in or wondering, should you set up your own self-managed super fund? And by the way, this is not financial advice because we don't know if you need to or not. Ken Race, who's not just an accountant, but also has the right financial planning qualifications, will be able to give you advice on that. And if you currently have a self-managed super fund and you want to get an audit of your fund, again, not on how its investments are performing, but is it set up correctly and optimally and maximally, just like I have just gone through. And Ken found a number of things that needed to be fixed in my fund. If you'd like to have that happen for you, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes, but go to Metropole, look at the Wealth Advisory tab. And I know it's now the end of the year and you think, oh, I'll leave it till next year. Just put your name down, inquire, and we don't have to do anything till next year. But if you don't do it now while it's fresh in your mind, it's probably going to escape you. So thanks, Ken, for explaining that particular service. And basically, you help our clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth safely to future generations as an adjunct to the property services we provide at Metropole. Now, just getting back to the various things that we need to understand about the economy to help make us better investors, business people, and entrepreneurs. One of the things that the latest statistics showed was profit from financial corporations rose about 4.9% during the quarter alone. The financial services sector is doing pretty nicely, Ken.
Yes, and to me, that's an unfortunate thing. You know, the banks were very quick to increase rates when
Aren't they?
but they're very slow to increase deposit rates. Raising deposit rates then raises the cost of money to a bank, which then is a secondary reason why they would increase interest rates. But there's a very large proportion of the population that relies on interest income to survive. Self-funded retirees, just name one as an example. So this is a startled look in the mirror for, I think, the financial institutions, that there is a little bit of a lag in the difference between increasing interest expenses, costs to consumers, versus increasing deposit rates. And the general rollover of activity as well. So we see a lot of advertising, don't be a slave to your bank, try and get a different rate if you think you're overpaying. So we're seeing a lot of switching. And with that actually does increase bank profitability and financial institution profitability. And we're now seeing the results of that, a 4.9% increase in their profitability.
In the quarter alone.
Quarter, yes.
So it was the fastest growth in financial profits since the September quarter of 2008. Now, as we again look at the general economy, the current account returned to deficit. Maybe you could just explain to listeners what the current account is and what this actually means.
So in simple terms, it's what we export is one number, so a dollar value on what we export. And we then look at the dollar value of what we import. And as an economy, we would like to export more than we import because that adds wealth to the country. When we've got a deficit, that means we are importing more than we're exporting.
Now, importing actually includes things like travel expenses, and interestingly, exporting includes education, overseas education. So it's not necessarily goods, but it also includes services, doesn't it?
Correct. And one of the big exporters for Australia is services. So education, health, as well as the more traditional things such as, coal, gas, some small manufactured goods. The imports then are really what's causing this deficit, because that's saying we're importing more than we are exporting. And in simple terms, that's the same as saying I'm dipping into my savings. And you can only do that for so long.
It can't continue. But this time around, it was actually fuel and motor vehicles that pushed the imports up. It'll be interesting but we said a moment ago that there was a bit of pent up demand there for that. But hopefully, moving forward, mining and I guess education, which is starting to pick up again, is going to change the balance of that. And as we go through the various things one needs to understand about the economy, the last one I'd like to mention, and it's no surprise to listeners of this podcast because they're interested in property, is how dwelling construction rebounded in the last quarter. Now, a lot of this is now still the flow and effect from those very many benefits, including home builder from a year or so ago, because it took a while to get them through the system and then get construction going on. But there still is actually quite a large pipeline of dwelling construction that's blown out the cost of construction because we now have quite a shortage of trades, of labour and of materials.
That's right. When you add all that together, we're actually seeing for the state governments an increase in their stamp duty collections. And that's basically what we've been just talking about now. So for the state governments, that's a silver lining because they see their coffers growing with the transfer of property from one person to another. And they call that stamp duty. For a lot of state governments, that represents the single largest tax that they generate. Certainly, if you add the other property-related taxes, land tax, stamp duty, of course, for most states, that represents 40 to 50% of their tax raising. So I think now that we're coming out of COVID, we're seeing baby boomers now getting to an age where they're thinking of moving or downsizing. So I think that whole sector over the next decade, I think will continue to show some surprisingly beneficial results.
Well, as we round all this off, obviously annual growth in our economy was artificially raised, reflecting the rebound from the lockdowns, because as we said, it's actually not the exact level that we're talking about, but the change in the cost of things. And now the question I know a lot of economists are asking is this as good as it gets? Quarterly economic growth is slowing, but inflation and wages pressure are becoming more evident. So I see the Reserve Bank as having a bit of a dilemma. It did raise interest rates again, but only by 0.25%. I'm saying only in December. It's now not going to do anything in January. It doesn't meet in January. And it'll be interesting to see what it does in February, because while it did talk about more interest rate rises next year, Ken, on the one hand, I think it's doing that to scare us a little bit and slow the economy down. On the other hand, I think the Reserve Bank recognises there is quite a lag, and it's going to take some time for the effect of those 8 interest rate rises to work through the economy. And I know in the back of their mind they are concerned, well, they've said it, about all those fixed rate mortgages that people are going to start to come out of next year, that's going to put pressure on our housing markets.
That's right. So there's going to be a false interest rate rise for a very large part of the population, as you say, when they move out of fixed rates a lot around the 2% to maybe something double that rate. We're going to see a large portion of the economy, 30%-ish of the population, seeing maybe a 40% increase in their repayments. I think the Reserve Bank is cognizant of that, which is maybe one of the reasons they started slowing down, from 0.5% increases to 0.25%. And as you say, the lag, that we're not seeing the full impact of the previous increases. And hopefully, a good Christmas doesn't turn the Reserve Bank into thinking they've got to turn the screws up even more.
It'll be interesting to see how people spend over Christmas. When it gets to its February meeting, it will have some official figures of inflation that are going to be due in late in January, the quarterly figures, because we're still not really sure what those new monthly figures mean, how accurate they are. There hasn't been a good enough track record of it. So there's going to be another interesting year. But I think when you look back, despite all the property pessimists and the people talking about real estate Armageddon, the property values have dropped 7%, 8% overall in Australia. Some segments of the market have done worse, including the higher, the more expensive properties in Sydney and Melbourne. Others have done much better than that. But it hasn't been a bad year. And next year will have challenges. But if you take a long-term perspective, we know that this is just what happens in the cycle. After a huge once-in-a-generation boom, we had to go through a tightening in the property market. The Reserve Bank is also tightening our economy, and then life will get normal again, Ken.
That's right. And we all shuddered when we heard, the recession that we had to have.
No, not we all. Most of the people listening to this weren't even born then, Ken.
That's probably an issue. A lot of the people listening to this haven't seen a decline in activity, so it's a bit of a shock for them. But this has happened before, and it's going to happen again.
That's right. Well, Ken, thank you for taking us through and helping explain what's going on with the economy. And I look forward to having these regular chats with you, with our public, in these podcasts next year. But clearly, as business partners, we chat almost every day. Thanks for your time, Ken.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, I hope you learned a bit from my chat with Ken Race. And it's probably close to the end of the year that you're listening to this, or maybe it's even over the Christmas holidays, and you're thinking about more fun things. But if you're serious about growing your wealth, I think it's worth having a conversation with Ken Race and his team at Metropole Wealth Advisory. Now, his services aren't for everybody, but a lot of our clients at Metropole use his more advanced services because they can help you plan and manage your wealth to achieve the financial goals, the commercial goals you're looking for. Now, Ken is recognised as one of Australia's leading experts in property tax, structuring, asset protection, SMSFs, legal tax minimisation and estate planning. Now, boy, that's a mouthful. But Ken's got the runs on the board, and you can take advantage of his experience and have him as part of your team. So I'm going to leave a link in the show notes, but just go to metropole.com.au and have a look at our wealth advisory services, and that's in addition to the property services that we have. I don't know what you need, but why not have a chat with our team, and we'll see if some or any of these services may help you to, I guess, give you more peace of mind that your financial affairs are coordinated by a single trusted advisor supported by a team of experts in their own fields of finance, tax, property and the law. By the way, if you'd like to spend 5 days with Ken and me, I think you should check out Wealth Retreat, where every year, well, for the last 15, 16 years, Ken and I have been spending 5 days with a small group of people, and it's going to be in 2023 on the Gold Coast at the end of April, where we're going to be sharing with you periods of mentoring, training, learning. You're going to get a lot from the expert faculty, but you're going to probably get as much by spending 5 days with a room full of already successful movers and shakers. Now, don't count yourself out about going to Wealth Retreat. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Go to wealthretreat.com.au and you can actually have breakfast, lunch and dinner with Ken and me and spend time with a group of already successful investors.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to talk to you about how to be happier with your money. Now, I recently heard a story about a wealthy couple who were at a party hosted by a multi-millionaire, and the wife said to her husband, "Do you realise that our host makes more money in one day than you do in a year?" Interestingly, her spouse's response was, "Yes, but I've got something he'll never have. Enough." Now, that's a great lesson to learn, isn't it? So how much money is really enough? Now, I grew up in a poor household where money was scarce, and while I can't actually remember when it was, I know I was very young when I decided I wanted to become wealthy. I wanted to become wealthy through property investment after seeing the lifestyle some of my friends' parents enjoyed because they owned investment properties. What I didn't realise at the time was that it was likely to take me 30 years to develop a big enough asset base to give me the sizable passive income that I was after. I didn't realise at the time that along the way I'd need a real job, I'd have to practice delayed gratification and money discipline, and I'd have to work long hours and hard and save and invest and reinvest my money. Back then, I didn't realise that you need to do the hard work early in your life so you can have an easier life later on. What I do remember was that I wanted to be a millionaire by the age of 30. Now, back then, and remember that was more than 50 years ago, a millionaire, $1 million was worth a lot more than it was today. So, how much money is enough? $1 million might have been sufficient 50 years ago, but how much is enough today? And how do you even work it out? Well, in his book, 30 Lessons for Living, Tried and True Advice from the Wisest Americans, gerontologist Carl Pillemer interviewed well over 1,000 elderly people mainly aged between about 80 and 100, and he was looking for sources of unique guidance from those who'd already lived a rich and fulfilling life. One of the things I found interesting was that not one person out of the 1,000 interviewed said that to be happy you should try to work hard or you should have as much money as you can to buy things you want. Not one person said it was important to be at least as wealthy as the people around you, and if you have more than they do, then you're a success. Not one person, not a single person said you should choose your work based on your desire for future earnings. Now, to be clear, the elderly didn't say that money isn't important, because it is. They didn't rule out that more money might have made them happier, because it most likely would have. Remember, any problem that money can solve isn't really a problem, is it? But it seems like the elderly understood the important concept of enough. Now, studies show that money does increase your happiness. Research that we quote in our book, Rich Habits, Poor Habits, that Tom Corley and I wrote and that has become an international bestseller and that's been translated into 5 languages, research we quote in our book shows that there's not even a known satiation point. A higher income makes virtually everyone happier, although each dollar delivers less happiness than the one before. Interestingly, psychologist Daniel Kahneman wrote in his book, This Will Make You Smarter, he wrote the following. On average, individuals with higher income are in better moods than people with lower income, but the difference is about 1/3 as large as most people expect. He also said, when you think of rich people and poor people, your thoughts are inevitably focused on circumstances in which income is important. But happiness depends on other factors more than it does on income. In other words, when I was young and saw all those rich landlords and wanted to be one myself, I imagined a big income would make me happier. Yeah, I was pretty miserable growing up. But I thought it would make me happier because I thought about the luxurious imported cars that the rich people drove, the nice houses they lived in, rather than thinking about the years of hard work that they had to put in and the lack of family life that they often sacrificed to get where they are now. Just look what happened to all those actors and the sporting heroes who earn staggering incomes yet ruin their family lives. So what does make you happier? Not surprisingly, psychologists have found, they've looked into it, they've actually looked to see what makes people happy, and researchers broadly agree that 4 major points have a big impact on making people happy. Number 1, having control over what you're doing. Number 2, progress in what you're pursuing. The 3rd point is connection with other people, and the 4th is having a purpose and meaning. That's it. You'll notice more money isn't on the list. But you can easily see how more money ties into these points. Money can grant you the freedom from being locked into a job that you don't enjoy. Money can provide the tools necessary to achieve progress in pursuing your goals. Money can afford you time off and a chance to spend time with the people that matter to you. Money can give you the ability to provide charity and community contributions, bringing meaning and purpose to your life. Yes, money is important in those areas where it's important, and not at all important in those areas where it's not important. So I believe striving to be rich, striving for financial independence is worthwhile, but it's a marathon, not a sprint. Yet it's a race worth running because it's going to allow you to live your life by design. You're going to have more control over your life. But think about it. How much money is enough? How will you know when you have enough? Will you ever know when enough is enough? Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?